It's been a joy to be associated with Maxie again. I don't know of a person that has a more tender heart than Maxie Boren. Maxie is, I knew Maxie when he was in school. It's been my privilege to know him throughout the years. And in my files at home, Maxie, are several articles that you've written that I treasure, and I refer to them frequently in preparation for lessons that I'm designing. This is both sweet and a bitter occasion for me. It's sweet because I get to see some people that I love very dearly. I don't know of any person that is any closer to our family than Mary Barnum. And it's kind of bitter because some of the people that I admire so much are not with us tonight. They're not with us because they've gone to a better place. I'd like to sit down and visit with them and talk with them, as would you, I'm sure. It's also a sweet occasion to be back to a place where I have a lot of fond memories. One of my daughters was married right here, Maxie, and one of them was baptized right up here. So this is a very special place for us. It's special because I'm here with some of the preacher fellows that I was in school when I was here. Tommy Haynes was one of the students here, and he was learning to shave about the time that he came here. And looking at his face, I don't know whether he's still learning or not. And Foy Forehand was here, and Ernie Christie, and I don't know, there may be others that were present. And it's so good to see you preaching the gospel. It's been my privilege during the past 4 days, and yours too, to take a special journey. A journey through Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, and 1st and 2nd Samuel. We've been encouraged by the faith and the leadership of such individuals as Caleb, Hannah, and Gideon, Joshua, and Ruth, and David. And certainly valuable lessons have been learned in our examination of the decisions of individuals such as Uzzah and Absalom, Samson and Saul. And we've learned more than just the culture and the geography and the genealogy of the times. And so now we come to that exciting study that's found in the closing chapters of 2 Samuel, the last 6 chapters of 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel deals almost exclusively, as you know, of the history of David as king of Judah and Israel. The first part of the book is concerned with David's reign over Judah, and the last division deals with his reign over the entire nation of Israel. During this period of time, David, as a king, was very successful in his military engagements with the Syrians and the Moabites, as well as the Ammonites and the Philistines and the Amalekites and others, nations around about them. David was victorious in many military campaigns because, as we read in the scripture, the Lord preserved David wherever he went. His success was not limited, though, to military encounters. He was a skillful administrator. And so David reigned over all Israel, and David administered judgment and justice to all of his people. There are 8 specific events that are not necessarily in chronological order that involve King David that are found in those closing 6 chapters of 2 Samuel, beginning with David's return to Jerusalem following Absalom's defeat and death, and then ending with David's sin of numbering the people in chapter 24. Our focus in this study will be twofold. One is on those characteristics of leadership that we find in David in these particular chapters, And then secondly, David as a singer of psalms, a writer and singer of psalms. David was one of the greatest leaders in all of history. More is written about him and the characteristics of his leadership than any other person in the Bible except for Jesus Christ. He only influenced men not only through what he said and what he did, but he continues to influence men even today. In paying tribute to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in April the 14th, 1941, Walter Lippmann said, "The final test of a leader is that he leaves behind him other men with the conviction and the will to carry on." David's leadership model, which may be seen in a variety of circumstances in the closing chapters of 2 Samuel, has served to encourage other leaders down through the ages to maintain convictions and muster the will to carry on. And so tonight, I'd like to see some things about David's leadership that we're going to categorize into three areas. In the first place, I'd like to look at David's leadership from the standpoint of the grief which he experienced. King David stood at the side of the city gate and watched his army march away to engage in battle with Absalom and his army. And he gave Joab the final instruction as he stood here by the gate. And he said to him, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." We know that the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim, and David's army prevailed, and Absalom was slain in spite of the clear command of the king to protect the young man Absalom. Messengers following the battle were dispatched to give a report to David of the outcome of the battle. David was sitting between the two gates, waiting to hear what was going on with his army. That is, between the outer gate and the inner gate of the city. A watchman on the wall announced the approach of two men. And David assumed that since they were approaching, that there would be good news. Amaziah, one of the runners, was the first to reach the king, and from the distance, he said, "All is well." And we know the question that was asked by David. He said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the runner said what he said to him was either ignorant or the circumstances, he didn't know about the circumstances, or he'd lied. He said, "I saw a great tumult, but I didn't know what it was all about." And because the answer lacked accurate information about Absalom, David told Amaziah to turn aside. The second runner was the Cushite, as we remember. He entered with news of the victory and said that things were going well. But David had the same question to ask of him: "Is the young man Absalom safe?" And with care, the Cushite said, "May the enemies of my lord, the king, and all who rise against you do you harm be as this young man is." The news of Absalom's death caused David to be deeply moved with a broken heart. He went up to the wall weeping. And we tonight remember so well those words that David said as he went up to that room on the upper side of that wall. "My son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. O Absalom, my son, my son." I don't know whether we can come to grips tonight with the feeling of the father who was experiencing such grief or not. Several years ago, when Joyce and I lived in New York State, we, in Jamestown, New York, we'd been back to Texas to visit, and maybe to this area, I'm not sure. But it was late at night when we came back home, and we were unloading our car and had taken things out of the trunk. And the girls had gone up into the house, and I was taking the last item out of the trunk, and I slammed the trunk down. And when I did, it hit something very soft, I looked down, our youngest daughter was standing there, and the trunk hit across here. I picked her up, and with blood on my shirt, I felt like, oh, if it had only been me. Maybe that in some way captures the feeling of David as he was grieving about his son. David was still weeping when his army returned. He could not think of anything but his grief. His sorrow over the death of his son was not in itself contrary, certainly, to proper leadership. But because David was self-absorbed with his grief, he neglected his leadership responsibility. And as one man said, David the father forgot that he was David the king. Some results of his leadership neglect in this critical time were that his army, believing that they must conceal their joy of victory, because here was their king that was weeping and crying. And so they stole back into the city, believing that they could not be victorious, express their joy of victory. Secondly, the victory was turned into mourning for all of the people. David's action was not understood by those whom he led. The people had a difficult time understanding David's actions, and they considered Absalom to be a traitor and a rebel, an insurrectionist, and because of this, the king and his family were in grave danger, and they thought that they were doing the king a service in destroying that rebel army. Certainly, we're not so unsympathetic that we cannot grieve with David, but leaders must lead even with a broken heart. Concerning the troops, he must be aware of their particular needs, and their needs must take precedence over the pains and troubles of the leader. Joab told David that his behavior suggested three things. First, your love for your enemy is greater than you hate your friends. You regard neither princesses nor servants. Your actions suggest that your commanders and servants are nothing to you, they said. That if Absalom had lived and all of us had died today, then it would have pleased you well, Joab said. Joab not only confronted David with his error, but gave positive counsel when he urged him to rise and go and speak to his servants. Certainly, David made a grave leadership mistake in not gratefully acknowledging the courage and the sacrifice of his mighty men. But he was the kind of leader that saw the value of a valid rebuke and the wisdom that came from sound reasoning that was expressed to him by Joab. Realizing, therefore, his grievous error, he took immediate corrective action, and the secluded room over the wall was not the place for the nation's leader. The gate was the place where effective leaders go to meet the people and give encouraging counsel. And so, the scripture says, the king arose and took his seat in the gate. Was David still grieving? Oh, yes, he was. But in going to the gate, he showed his determination not to allow his grief to cause him to forsake his role as a leader. This period following the defeat of Absalom and his army was a time that was requiring leadership skill in bringing harmony to a divided nation. The tribe of Judah had supported Absalom in his rebellion. Confusion and the threat of anarchy followed the war. Strife prevailed in the absence of their king. And in spite of the fact that there was nothing to be gained in delaying the recall of David to the throne, there was a reluctance on their part to extend an invitation to the very one that could help to unify the nation in this desperate time. For the most part, the Israelites had remained loyal to the dynasty of Saul under the leadership of Abner and Ishbaal. Now, all the people were in dispute throughout all the tribes of Israel, we're told in the historical record. Prejudice and animosity must be dealt with very wisely on the part of the leader. It was within David's power to immediately return to Jerusalem following Absalom's defeat. He chose rather to reclaim the throne in a very peaceful manner, a manner that would involve the people's desire for his return. And so one of the first steps that David took as a peacemaker is seen in his approach to the very ones that had instigated the coup. In an effort to calm the strife and to unify the people, he sent his 2 priests to the people, to the elders of Judah, with a message which asked them to take the lead in recalling and restoring him to the throne. He asked, "Why are you the last to bring the king back to his house? Are you not my brethren? You are bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And we remember in this connection the strife that existed between Abraham, his herdsman, and Lot and his herdsman, and the sage advice that Abraham gave to Lot on that occasion. "Let there be no strife between us," he said, "for we are brethren." When confusion and strife threatens the unity of God's people, bold, compassionate leadership is needed to restore harmony and order. The success of David's effort to gain Judah's united support is seen in 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 14. "And so he swayed the hearts of all the men of Judah, just as the heart of one man. So they sent this word to the king, 'Return you and all your servants.'" Even though Judah, as the heart of one man, invited David to return to their king, there were matters involving Israel, the other 10 tribes, that must be solved if the nation was to be united. And so David made some moves to encourage the unity of the people. Some of those moves that he made were not all of that brilliant. For example, when moving back to Jerusalem, he appointed Amasa to take Joab's position as the commanding general of the army. Brother Burton Kaufman, who is now in his late 90s, still preaches, and it's our privilege at North MacArthur to hear him come and preach to us each year. He had this comment to say about this incident in David's life. He said, "There is no device by that which decision could be justified." That is the decision that David made to appoint a new commander in his army. With all of his faults, Joab was loyal to David, and Amasa was David's enemy. In this situation, David came, and this is where Brother Kaufman's humor comes out, I suppose. He said, "In this situation, David came very near to demonstrating that the old man had lost his marbles." It's an understatement to say the removal of Joab and the appointment of the traitor Amasa as the commander of the army would have been an insult to the loyal men of David's army. We don't know exactly why David did that. John Willis tried to explain that in his commentary by saying that perhaps it was to win the favor of the Judeans and to punish Joab for killing Absalom. If these are the reasons for the king's actions, he may have accomplished his objective, but the poor actions brought unnecessary animosity, which ultimately led to Amasa's murder. While David was a man after God's own heart, he sometimes acted and made decisions independent of the heart of God, something a leader must never do. It was a sad and difficult time for King David when he announced plans to abandon Jerusalem and flee for his life because of Absalom's insurrection. And some of the things that transpired during his fleeing from Jerusalem shows how David handled that situation. Every leader receives criticism of one sort or another, some worse than others. David was criticized for the action that he was taking on this occasion. The route that he took, or the route that he took him eastward of the city over the brook of Kidron and up on Mount Olivet, where he paused to worship God, and somewhere not far from Olivet toward the fords of Jordan, David was met by a man who cursed him. And the passage says that he cursed him while he was coming, and he cursed him as he went. Shimei's attack on David was not limited to words. He cast stones at him and threw dust at him. Shimei's slander was such that Absa would have silenced him forever had David not graciously intervened and said something, a part of which I do not understand, he said, "Let him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has bidden him." I'd like for you to fast forward with me for just a moment to a time following Absalom's death, to a place on the east side of the Jordan, where David and his delegation were making their final preparation to return to Jerusalem. And Judah came to Gilgal to meet the king, to escort the king across Jordan on that occasion. And in company with them was this same fellow who had been cursing the Lord, had been cursing David, and had been throwing stones at him. He came hurried down with the men of Judah to meet David. There were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and he came down to seek David's forgiveness. But Abishai, who said, "Shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because David is the Lord's anointed?" How many of us, in like circumstances, might identify with this man's proposal, but not David? For the second time, he prevents his nephew from taking Shimei's life, saying, "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zerah, that you should be adversaries to me today? Shall not any man be put to death today in Israel? For I do not know that today I am king over Israel." In responding to Shimei's plea for mercy, the king said, "You shall not die." By granting the pardon, David clearly announced his intention to be merciful to his return to the throne. When David returned to this throne, not everyone was glad that he was returning. David's leadership was often tested. In fact, there were few times in David's life when he was not tested. His trials were so many and so severe that one wonders when he had time or the desire to compose and sing songs, and yet he is known as the sweet psalmist of Israel. The last 3 chapters of 2 Samuel contain non-chronological information regarding King David's life. There are 6 specific topics discussed in these chapters. I would like tonight to be concerned with just one of those. That is David, the author and the singer of Psalms. David entered the scene in sacred history playing the harp and singing. As a shepherd boy, he was known for his ability to play the harp. King Saul suffered from a punishing spirit that had been sent from the Lord, because the king persisted in his disregard of God's will. And Saul's servant suggested that a search be made for a man who was skillful in the ability to play the harp. They said, "And it shall be that he will play with his hand when the distressing spirit of God is upon you." And so one of the servants recommended to Saul that there was a son of Jesse that was a skillful musician, and whose music could make the king well. And so Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." And the text tells us, "And so David came to Saul and stood before him. And so it was, whenever the Spirit of God from God was upon Saul, that David would take a harp and play it with his hand. And then Saul would become refreshed and well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him." The shepherd boy served Saul in the capacity as an armor bearer, a soldier, and a musician until he faced grave threats from the king, and we remember how that he had to flee for his life. He tried, because King Saul tried to kill him. David fled for his life, and some of the Psalms, such as Psalms 59, reflect his anguish during these very difficult times in his life. With bewilderment, he asked God to save him from bloodthirsty men. He petitions God to take note that they lie in wait for my life, he said. He says, "The mighty gather against me for my transgressions, not for my transgressions, nor for my sins." In spite of the lack of apparent answers to the difficult questions that he faced, he claims his confidence in God in saying, "To you, O my strength, I will sing praises, for God is my defense." the God of my mercy. Now, as I look at the various Psalms that David wrote, and there are some 70, it is believed, that he wrote, that are recorded, these songs tell us some things about David's heart. I would like to focus on that for the remaining part of our lesson tonight. The songs that David sung tell much about him, but someone has said that if you really want to know what's in the heart of the people of a nation, listen to the songs that they sing. I think that's true also with the church. The Psalms that David authored were written in various intervals in his life, beginning with the days as a young boy in the courts of King Saul, and continuing through such periods when he hid in caves from his enemies and when experiencing the joy of following victory in battle. The Psalms he wrote when coping with troubled conscience because of personal sin, and when dealing with a rebel son who sought his throne, like all of the others, expose the heart of the psalmist. In reading the Psalms of David, one of the first things that we see is a heart filled with deep faith in God. It is a faith which causes him to marvel at God's majesty. An example where this is vividly seen is in Psalms chapter 8, which begins in verse 1 by saying, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, and ends with the exclamation in verse 3 through 5 of the Psalms. Tell us what has moved him to move, and these verses tell us what it moves him to make this exclamation. He said, when I consider the heavens and the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've ordained, what is man that you're mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visited him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. First, David's heart is filled with awe as he considers what God created. He is deeply stirred by the power and the wisdom of God as he observes what we call nature. In Psalms 19, verses 1 through 3, he exclaims, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. The revelation of God and his greatness in the heavens is far from being silent. The heavens declare the glory of God, whether it's day or whether it's night. Furthermore, David says it does not matter where you go in the world, the language declaring God's glory is universal. Everywhere and anywhere on earth, you can see his handiwork. We might turn back to Psalms 8 for just a moment and note the second thing that causes David to marvel at God's majesty. Acknowledging God to be the creator, he asks, what is man that you're mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visited him? In comparison with all of creation, man seems so insignificant that David wonders why God even bothered with man. We can do the same thing, but we can go beyond David. We marvel that this great God was so concerned about us that he gave his Son to die for our souls that we might be saved. That God is interested in man is more than a marvelous thought. It is a thought that is really difficult for us to comprehend and to fathom. One of the reasons for David's faith in God was his intense thirst for God as expressed in Psalms 42. While this psalm was not ascribed to any particular person, it is thought by some to bear the marks of David's style. Charles Spurgeon said that this psalm is so Davidic that it smells the son of Jesse. One of our hymns, we know, is based upon that psalm. Note especially the first 3 verses. As the deer pants for the water brooks, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night, while they continue to say to me, where is your God? This shows us a heart that has an intense longing to know God and to be close to him. In another psalm, he says, O God, you are my God. Early will I seek you, and my soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water. Behind this longing is a courageous faith. He knows that the Lord will command his loving kindness in the daytime, and in the night his song, he said, shall be with me. As I think about David's thirst for the Lord, I have to ask myself this question. Charles, do you thirst for the Lord like David did? Is this the way that we approach prayer and worship? Does our heart pant for God? David's longing for God should describe all of God's people. If we have this thirst, it will make a great difference in the way that we approach our service and our worship to God. The 51st Psalm is perhaps one of the Psalms that we remember best because it is often called the penitential Psalm. David describes himself as one who had been entrapped in sin and struggling for freedom. And with a nagging conscience, he says, my sin is ever before me. Last Sunday morning, I talked to my Bible class at North MacArthur, and I said, class, one of the reasons why that we need to live the very best that we can in all good conscience every day is because if we don't, that conscience is going to bother us. And even the great Apostle Paul said later on, as he reflected upon the kind of life that he'd lived before he became a Christian, that I persecuted the church, and that was a regret that he had. He said, I'm the chief of sinners. Here was David, and he said, my sin is ever before me. And in sorrow he tells God, against you and you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight. What does the psalm tell us about the heart of David? Does it not tell us that David had a heart set on right living? Listen to David's plea. Listen to it again. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit in me. You see, he wants to be forgiven, and this is not the only thing. David wants his heart changed so that he will not repeat the sin again. The music had gone out of David's life, and he no longer wanted to live that way, and so he prays, make me hear the joy and the gladness that the bones which you have broken may rejoice. Verse 8. He wants a new heart. He wants a clean heart. He wants a heart that will help him to live right. He wants a heart that will help him to teach transgressors. God gave the king a clean heart. And you know, he put a new song in his mouth, according to Psalms chapter 40 and verse 3. All of those who aspire to sing a new song must set their hearts on right living. One of the thrilling things that we learn about David's heart from the Psalms is his desire for his heart to be open before God. And his plea for openness is recorded in Psalms 139, where it says, search me, O God, know my heart, try me and know my anxieties, and see if there's any wicked way in me, and lead me to the way everlasting. Think about that for just a moment. Search me, know my heart, try me, know my thoughts, and see if there's any wicked way in me. This is the way the heart is supposed to be before God. I wonder, when was the last time you prayed that kind of prayer? Search me, know my heart, try me, and know my thoughts, and see if there's any wicked way in me. That's a pretty challenging thought, isn't it? David invites God to make a careful examination of his life to see if there's anything wrong, and if so, bring it to the surface. That degree of heart openness is probably not on the agenda of many of us, at least very often. If he searches and tries us, he will turn up something needing improvement. However, when it is turned up and we confess it, God is faithful and just to forgive us of our sins, just like he forgave David. And so the king fervently prayed that a thorough search be made of his heart. You see, he was willing to be completely open to God. And again, I have to ask myself, am I? Am I completely open to God? Have I reached the point in my life that I can genuinely pray the prayer that's contained in these two verses? Think how much richer your relationship with God can be and will be by inviting God to conduct an open heart search for the purpose of overcoming anything that's wrong, to the end that you might correct it even to be more like him. The words of a song that David sang to the Lord, recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 22, is also found in Psalms chapter 18. It is a psalm that reveals the heart filled with praise for God. And so David exclaims, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, my shield, and the horn of my salvation." And he sings, "I call to the Lord who's worthy of praise." Some of the things in this psalm for which David expresses praise are: 1, God hears and responds to his cries for help in time of distress by providing light